We have come now to the final book in the historical section of the Old Testament. So, with the exception of First and Second Chronicles, which was kind of an overlay over the four books that led up to it, and a little bit of order here. Esther doesn't fit last; it fits a little earlier than that. We followed a timeline from the book of Genesis. We saw the selection of Abraham, and now we've been following the story of the people of God all the way through this timeline until things go silent around 430 AD up until the time of Christ. And so this is the last book in that historical section, this book of Esther. The book of Esther, its purpose is to demonstrate the providence of God. We see God kind of working from the shadows, keeping watch over his own people through the book of Esther. There are times in life where we don't see God. We don't see the hand of God. But we can be encouraged, especially through the message of Esther, that there are no times in our life where God doesn't see us, where his watchful eye is not upon us. A couple of verses to keep in mind as we peruse through the book of Esther. First one on the screen, Psalm 121. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. Okay, God doesn't fall asleep on his watch over his people. He knows what's going on in the lives of his people, and he's involved in their lives. A New Testament equivalent to that statement, Jesus made this statement in John 5. Jesus answered and said, "My Father has been working until now, and I have been working." When the Bible says that God rested on the seventh day, it doesn't mean that God stopped being active in the lives of individuals or in his care over humanity, his involvement in the universe. It meant that he simply was done with the creative act. In fact, scientists will tell us that matter is neither created nor destroyed. It simply changes form. Why? Because God was done creating. The only violation to that, I think, is when Jesus had 5 loaves and 2 fish and needed more, and he used his God divine ability to speak more matter into existence. But God's resting doesn't mean he slept. It doesn't mean that he's no longer active in our lives. God is watching over his people. Now, the word providence is an interesting word. It's not necessarily a biblical word, although it carries a biblical idea. The word providence comes from a Latin word, pro verdi. And the word pro means before, and verdi means to see. And so the idea behind providence is to see beforehand. And God is looking, he sees everything before it happens, and he's working towards the accomplishment of those things. We see that earthly life is filled with heavenly guidance. It's been aptly stated that history is really his story. God's hand involved in human affairs. Now, sometimes these things are very evident. We have Moses. His life was interrupted as God spoke audibly to him from a burning bush. We have Joshua, as the children of Israel, as the priest's feet touch the water in the Jordan parts and they walk across. We have Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, whose world is interrupted when the hand of God appears and etches something into the plaster wall. We have Mary, who has the very Son of God laid in the manger of the stable. So there are times when God interrupts the affairs of humanity very evidently. There are other times, like in the book of Esther, where God's work seems to be hidden. It seems to be behind the scenes. Seen or unseen, God's care, his guidance, his deliverance of his people is no less effective. In the book of Esther, we're going to see that God is ordering the events of the universe for 2 purposes. Number 1, we'll see that it is to accomplish his ultimate goal. And so God's ordering things to get his will done. Secondly, we're going to see that he does it in such a way that the individuals accomplish their purpose. You see, Esther was created by God with a specific purpose in mind. And the book of Esther, her story, unveils to us that purpose. Her purpose was to save a nation. Her purpose was the salvation of a nation. And I don't think it's stretching it too far to say that that's what God's purpose for our lives is as well. God has a purpose for our life. And that purpose involves the ministering to others, the bringing others into relationship with Jesus Christ. I was really blessed this week. My wife was having some conversation with a person from our church who had sent her a text saying, "Hey, pray for me. I'm going to meet with a friend of mine who's not a believer. We're meeting for the specific purpose. We're having lunch together so I can tell her about Christ. Pray for me." And then she contacted her later and said she accepted the Lord. She's in the kingdom. And God has, praise the Lord. God has that purpose in mind for each of us. And Esther reveals that truth. Esther uncovers that. Now, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are clustered together in your Bible. And the reason for that is that all three of them deal with the Jewish people, the people of God, after the Babylonian captivity. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah both deal with the Jewish people who have gone back into Jerusalem to work. Ezra, they are building the temple, and Nehemiah, they are building the city walls. Esther is a bit different in that Esther focuses on the much larger group of people, the masses of Jews who did not return to Jerusalem. And it focuses on life for them post-captivity. They were free to return. They didn't, and it focuses to some degree on the life that they experienced. If you were putting things in order, it would go like this: Ezra 1 through 6, then the book of Esther, then the rest of the book of Ezra, then the book of Nehemiah. So if you wanted to read them in order, that would be the order in which they go. And all of these events are taking place, the events in Esther are taking place in the capital of Persia, in Shushan, and they're dealing under the reign of a king by the name of Ahasuerus. He's also known in history by the name of Xerxes. And the reason for the two names, Xerxes is the Greek name, Ahasuerus the Persian name, possibly even a Persian title. Interesting fact about the book of Esther is that the book of Esther never uses the name of God. It never even uses titles for God. We read, the Lord, which would be a translation of Yahweh or Jehovah throughout our Old Testament chronicle. We read about other titles, he's called the great God, the mighty God, these various terms that are used for him. None of those terms are used in the book of Esther. But it is wrong to say that God is not mentioned in the book, because he's seen behind the scenes throughout the book. One man put it like this. He said, God is in the book of Esther, not in syllables, but events, not in miraculous intervention, but as the guiding wheels of providence. Not in open communication, but as the unseen power over all. And so we're going to see God very active in the book without ever his name being brought up. And I think that it's by design. The Spirit of God, by design, put this book together, because there are times in our life where we're wondering, where is God? We're going through something and we're going, Lord, where are you? And one of the key factors in the book of Esther is that God's at work even when we don't see him. And we're going to pick up this idea of providence again at the end of our study tonight as we talk about why studying the book. And we'll just walk again through some of the providential aspects of the hand of God upon his people, even when they didn't see it in advance. Now, that being said, the book focuses on 5 main characters. Okay? The star of the book is Esther. By the way, her name means star. Okay? So if your name is Esther, it means star. Okay? It's a Persian name, but it's in the Bible, so you should be happy. And it means star. And she is, in fact, as we would use the term, she is the star of the book. In addition to Esther, we also meet her cousin, Mordecai. We also meet a king by the name of Ahasuerus or Xerxes. We meet his wife, or one of his many wives, whose name is Vashti. She's the queen. And we also meet a villain by the name of Haman. And Haman is one of the worst characters in human history. And we'll meet him through the pages of this book together. Now, the book focuses on one major crisis that the people are facing. You go, well, what are the crises that you are facing in your life today? What are the things that are hitting you? For some of you, it's health. It's something you're going through physically, and you're just saying, man, that's the major crisis that I'm facing. For some of you, there's some family ordeal that you're going through that is the crisis. For some of you, it's some emotional thing that you're experiencing. That is your crisis. There is one major crisis in the book of Esther that overshadows all of the other crises, and that is this: the threat of total extermination of the people of God. So that's a serious crisis. Okay? That's what's on the table. That's what the believers are dealing with during the time of Esther. They're dealing with the reality that their entire population, every Jew, is going to be put to death. That's the crisis. And that's what we'll see unfold, and that's what we'll see the providential hand of God step in the way of and stop as we go through the book. Now, in terms of an outline, the book of Esther is really just a story from start to beginning. So the outline is chapter 1 through 10. There's the outline. Now, some, because they think, well, that's too much to read in one sitting, I need a break, so they'll divide the book this way. The first 5 chapters kind of deal with the crisis as it's developing or being anticipated. And then chapters 6 through 10 deal with the crisis being prevented. So if that helps you, if that makes it easier for you, the first 5 chapters, we're kind of building towards this one thing, and then the final 5 chapters deal with it and fix the problem. So let's work our way through the book. Verse 1, chapter 1, we are introduced in chapter 1 to 2 of our main characters, Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, and his wife Vashti. Verse 1, now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel, that on the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all the officials, servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, the princes, and the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And it goes on to describe some of the things that were there at this feast. So as the book opens, we're introduced to this king. And what's happening is this king has had a great party, a great celebration. This celebration lasts for 6 months. This celebration, although the focal point is Shushan, in the capital there, his palace, it no doubt ventured beyond that. And the purpose of this, he was taking the leaders. This was a massive empire. It was an empire that went as far east as India, as far west as the borders of Greece, up through northern Iran and down through North Africa into Ethiopia. It was a massive empire that had been developed over the past 50 years. And he was gathering together the leaders, the nobles of these 127 provinces. So the senators and the governors and leaders of the various areas were gathered together, and he was showing off the incredible wealth of the king. It took him 6 months. Okay, now pause. How long would it take you to show off yours? It's like, well, I don't lock my car because there's just not anything worth taking. You understand that? So for 6 months, well, this time's out. And at the end of that, they have then a feast that lasts another 7 days. And this feast is open now to all the people, small and great. It's a feast throughout the empire. Now, history verifies these kind of events that would take place in Persia. This incredible opulence, incredible wealth. The purpose behind this particular feast is not given to us in the text, but there is a historical record supports what's going on here. Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, was the fourth king of the Persian Empire. His father was a very important figure in history by the name of Darius the First. His son is a very important person in biblical history. His name is Artaxerxes. He's the king from the book of Nehemiah that gives the command for Jerusalem to be rebuilt and starts the clock for the countdown of the coming of the Messiah. This Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, he reigned for 20 years. He took over the reign at the death of his dad. And his reign ended when he was assassinated by his chief bodyguard and some of the servants there in the palace. When he came to power, the last sort of campaign that his father was involved in was an attempt to push the borders of the Persian Empire farther west into Greece. And he had taken 50,000 soldiers, and they'd gone to Greece to do battle at a place called Marathon. And this is a very famous battle in history. One of the reasons that this battle is so famous is because the Greeks withstood the Persians. There were 10,000 Greeks, 50,000 Persians. They went to battle, and the Greeks withstood them. And that marked the stop of the spread of the Persian Empire and the beginning of what would ultimately be the spread of the Grecian Empire or Grecian thought that would spread throughout that whole area of the world 150 years later with Alexander the Great. We'll talk about that in the book of Daniel. Now, interesting story there with this Battle of Marathon. When the Greeks withstood the Persians and pushed them back, the Persians got in their ships and they decided that they would make their way towards Athens and that they would conquer Athens, burn it to the ground. And an ancient historian, his name is Herodotus, and he is actually referred to as the father of history. He is as we go back and he sort of set the standard for historical record keeping. And this man records about how a man was sent after this battle by the Greeks. He was sent and he ran over a course of a couple of days. He ran 140 miles to a place called Sparta. He told the Spartans about what was happening with the Persians, and they made the journey to Athens. And upon arriving at Athens, they solidified the city. And when the Persians arrived and saw that the Greeks were ready to fight back, they gave up. They did not attack, and they went back. Now, there's a legend. Some sources will say that it's a true story. Some sources say that it's not. Runners will be particularly interested in this. Marathon is 26 miles from Athens. And the legend is that after that battle, that in addition to a guy being sent to Sparta, a guy ran for the 26 miles from Marathon to Athens in a 3-hour period of time to warn the people about the threat of the Persians. Okay, so he's this great hero. He ran the marathon in 3 hours. So the story goes on to say that he also died of exhaustion. So you may want to push for 4 hours just to be safe. Anyway, this all happened there at Marathon. Why is it important to our story? Well, Ahasuerus gathers together all these nobles and the people together in order to unite Persia in this conquest that he has of wanting to go take Greece. He wants to conquer. He wants to pick up where his dad left off. In one sense, he thought, if my dad sent a wave against Greece, I'm going to send the ocean. And he would muster a large army to go attack them. Now, as chapter 1 unfolds, this party that they were having, in order to kind of unite this thing, it turned into sort of a ruckus for everyone. And they're celebrating and they're drinking, just partying down. And as they do, foolish decisions start being made. And that's not uncommon when alcohol is thrown into the mix. Okay, so let me just throw this at you, a couple of verses. Proverbs 20, verse 1, it's on the screen. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler. Whoever is led astray by it is not wise. Okay? Never are decisions better because you're pickled when you make them. Okay? Never. Okay? They're not going to help you. They're never, ever adding some sort of a substance is never going to make things better in your life. Okay? It's not going to happen. Another verse, Proverbs 31, verse 4, says, it's not for kings, O Lemuel. It's not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicating drink. In other words, this is written, a parent to a child who will reign, and says, listen, fools, it's okay for them, but you're not that guy, okay? You need to stay away from that. And, I find it interesting, and this is my soapbox for just a second, but I find it interesting that in a world that would villainize someone for wanting to go get a 64-ounce soda, will not say anything about somebody who will walk in and get themselves a case of beer. You understand? I mean, it's promoted as such a positive thing. Hey, we're just having fun. It's great. All of this. But, we have the government wanting to get involved and restrict your ability to drink soda pop. Like, really, like, wait, where do I live? Like, what planet does this make sense on? Moving on. In this drunken state, Ahasuerus calls for his wife Vashti the queen, and he wants her to come in before his men. She was leading a celebration with the women, and so he sends word to her and says that he wants her to come in wearing her crown because he wants to show off her beauty. Now, we don't know for certain. Some of the ancient tradition is that he wanted her to arrive with nothing but the crown, and so whether that's true or not, we don't know. It's certain that what he was asking her to do was improper. It's possible that it was even immoral. And you can imagine, just in any state, it doesn't matter what you're wearing. Women, you don't want to walk into a room full of drunken men. Like, no woman wants to do that. Okay, and so he's drunk, he's acting stupid, he invites her in, she refuses to come. Now, this guy, Ahasuerus, he's the king of the most powerful nation in the world, and he's used to people doing what he wants, and when they don't do what he wants, he reacts violently. And so in this case, she won't come, and he's around with all his nobles, all these guys, they make the law. And somebody turns and says, you got to do something. This is very, very bad. If word gets back to our wives that your wife, this is true story, read the passage. If word gets back to our wives that your wife won't listen to you, this whole nation's a mess. So you got to deal with this right now. So here's what they decide. They decide they're going to strip her of her title and they're going to banish her. So she's basically now, she's probably still living at the palace. She has nothing to do with the king anymore. She has been ostracized. She is out. And then a letter is sent, true story, a letter is sent throughout the entire province saying, listen, you might have heard what Vashti did. Well, this is what we did to her. So do what your husband says. Okay? That's in chapter 1. Now, chapter 2 begins, and there's a break here. There's 4 years of silence between chapter 1 and chapter 2. The Bible's silent about those 4 years. Nothing transpires. The reason that nothing transpires around the palace is because Xerxes, Ahasuerus, he has now gathered together this army, and he'll go back to Greece. Ancient historians record that he took an army of 1 million soldiers to go attack Greece. Other ancient records refer to it as being somewhere more in the neighborhood of 500,000. Modern historians have a real hard time with that, not because of the inaccuracy of the record keepers, but because of the sheer fact, how could you possibly march 500,000 to 1 million soldiers, feed them, take care of them, take care of the horse? How would you possibly ever do that? They can't get their head around it. Whatever the case, this was perhaps the largest military campaign in history. And Xerxes that's why he spent 6 months whining and dining these guys, because he was going to send them into battle. And they went to battle against the Greeks to attempt to conquer that area. He wanted to complete what his dad had started. This is a very famous battle in history. It's the Battle of Thermopylae. And that battle is the battle that if you saw, I didn't see the movie, but the movie 300, if you saw that movie, that's the storyline. Whether that movie follows the storyline, I don't know. But that movie is telling that story. 300 Spartans with about 700 other Greek soldiers would withstand this massive Persian army for 7 days of battle. And there were other soldiers other than the 1,000, but there was this narrow impasse, and these 300 soldiers were the final, they were kind of the final line, and they fought off the Persians. And really the only reason that they were defeated is because there was a traitor in the camp, and he had told the Persians about another route to get around them, and they were defeated. When that defeat happened, the Persians continued to Athens, where the city was burned. They had the intention then of continuing the complete conquering of Greece, but the weather became so rough that they were unable to do it. And this again is a very important event in human history, because it was that battle, that attempted conquest, that fueled a hatred in the Greeks towards the Persians that built and built and built for 150 years. And 150 years later, a ruler of one of these small city-states in Greece called Macedon, a young man, 17 years old, named Alexander, gathered together a handful of Greek soldiers, began to conquer the other Greek city-states, and then began to take an army to go conquer Persia. And it was his conquest that spread Greek thought throughout that part of the world, that paved the way for the Roman Empire. It paved the way for the coming of Christ. It paved the way for the spreading of the gospel. Okay, so a very important event happens right here in your Bible between chapter 1 and chapter 2. The reason Esther's silent is because Esther's focusing on Shushan. Nothing's happening in Shushan because of this great attempted conquest that's going on. Now, in chapter 2, the Bible picks the story up again. And we're told that after this failed attempt of completely conquering Greece, we're told in verse 1, after these things, so you know what these things are now, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti was gone and what had been decreed about her. So he starts to get lonely. He's like, man, I wish I didn't get drunk and do that stupid thing. I wish Vashti was still around. So he gathers his counselors. He says, what am I going to do? And somebody comes up with an idea. It was probably really difficult to convince him. They said, why don't we go hunt down all the best-looking, unmarried young women in the whole city, or the whole nation, and we'll bring them here, and we'll just, parade them before you, and you'll just pick your favorite, and she'll be the queen. Oh, gee, gosh, I guess so. If I have to. And so they begin this process. They're hunting down these women. They're bringing them together. They'll spend a year, these women, in this basically spa, being beautified and learning the ways of the palace life and getting ready. And at his beck and call, they would be brought before him. Now, while it sounds like, if Disney did it, it would sound so romantic, being picked as the queen and everything else. But the reality is most every one of these women was rejected. When they rejected, it didn't mean that you went back to the farm and married your high school sweetheart. It meant that you became one of the countless concubines of the king. So this is not something like, yes, stoked, I got the golden ticket, I get to go parade before the king. It meant probably, more likely than not, you're going to spend the rest of your life as one of his concubine, which means no one else can ever marry you, and he'll probably have nothing to do with you. And with that, Esther gets the call that she's going to be brought to the king. Chapter 2 tells us of her being brought before the king. But first, we're just introduced to her. A couple facts about Esther. One, she was an orphan. Her parents died. She was raised by her older cousin. She is a very beautiful woman. Over and over again, her beauty is referred to. And we see that her beauty was not just an external beauty, it was an inward beauty. Her cousin, Mordecai, who had raised her, had ministered to her, had kept her, is an important figure there around the palace. He serves in the gate, which would be like some sort of a city council that he was involved in, and Esther is then brought before the king. Now, one of the interesting facts about Esther, and we read it, we're told in verse 15 of chapter 2, now when the turn came for Esther, who had taken, let's see. Now when the turn came for Esther to go into the king, she requested nothing but what the king's eunuch, the custodian of women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. These women were doing everything that they could do to win the eye of the king. They don't want to be that concubine. They want to be the queen. And Esther, when she goes, she doesn't do that. She doesn't bring anything except what this guy says, well, you need to do that. Like, you need to at least do this. It's like she's not willing to conform to the ways of all the other women in order to get what God has for her life. And I think that's an important lesson for every woman here. I think that's a very valuable lesson. Well, as the story continues, she's chosen. The king looks at her. He falls for her. He chooses her. And as chapter 1 ends, we're told about her cousin Mordecai and how he uncovered a plot of some people that were attempting to assassinate the king. And he hears about it, and he warns someone who warns the king, and the king is rescued. On we go, chapter 3. In chapter 3, we're introduced to the final of these 5 main characters. We've seen Ahasuerus, Vashti, Mordecai, and Esther, and now we're introduced to this guy, Haman. And Haman, we're told a couple of things about him. Number 1, Haman was an Agagite. So that might ring a bell to some of you. An Agagite. I know that when I taught the first time at the church that I talked about the King Agag, I had someone coming up to me doing that Popeye thing afterwards. Agag, 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 agag. Okay, so he's hard to forget once you're introduced to him. This Amalekite king named Agag. And this man, Haman, is a descendant of King Agag. Okay, so he is someone who, the Amalekites hated the Jewish people. He is someone that continues that hatred towards God's people. We're also told that he was promoted there in verse 1 to be essentially the prime minister. And that Mordecai, for whatever reason, Mordecai refused to bow and show homage to Haman. So Haman gets his new position. He's second in power to Xerxes, and everybody bows. And again, Mordecai has some sort of an important role. He's there in the gate, but Mordecai just won't bow. Now, why he won't bow is unclear. Because while the Bible says we're not to have any gods, we're not to bow down before any sort of graven image, we don't put some sort of, image to some weird deity up here on the stage and you come and bow to it. That would be sin. But it's not sin to show respect to authority. In fact, the Bible teaches us the need to do that. So, and it's hard for me to imagine that Mordecai was in this position of authority in the nation and didn't bow to the king. But for some reason, he refuses to bow to Haman. We don't know why. We just know he won't do it. And Haman goes ballistic. He goes, fleshometer maxes out, and he has this hatred for the Jewish people. Now, in light of Sunday morning's Bible study, we talked about persecution. Let's take a look at chapter 3, verse 8. We see the real reason Haman hated the Jewish people. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in the province of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other people." The difference. The fact that these guys wouldn't acquiesce. They lived differently. They wouldn't bow down and live the way the rest of the people lived, and it caused them to hate them. And that's usually the seed of persecution. And so Haman plans then, instead of just wanting to kill Mordecai, instead of just saying, okay, you're dead, he says he's a Jew, so all the Jews are going to die. And he plans the annihilation of every Jew in the empire. That's his goal. And he writes an edict. He has the king sign it. It's sealed with the king's signet ring. And this edict goes out to every province. And here's what it says. It says on this particular date, 11 months in the future, on this particular date, you are to bear arms. You are to go to all of the Jewish people in your area, and you're to kill every one of them. And you're to take their goods, and you're to give their goods to the government. That's what we're doing. So it was a genocide. It was an attempt to completely wipe them out. So that's chapter 3. We move into chapter 4. And chapter 4 is the reaction of God's people to this news. There's 3 reactions. The first one is Mordecai. Let's take a look. Verse 1, when Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes, put sackcloth and ashes, and went in the midst of the city and cried out with a loud and bitter cry. Okay, what's he doing? In one word, it starts with a P and ends with a ray. What's he doing? That's right, he's praying. Very good, class. Okay, here he is. He's crying out to the Lord. His response is, we're dead. Now, I want you to imagine this. I want you to imagine that you did something that wasn't completely forbidden in God's word. It was kind of a gray area. I'm not sure if I should bow to this guy. I just don't feel good about it. I don't think the Lord wants me to do it. I don't have chapter and verse for it, but I just really don't feel good about bowing to this guy, so I'm not going to bow. And your refusal to bow, and now there's an edict that comes out that says, 2 million people are going to be murdered because of what you just did. How do you feel? That's the reality. That's what this guy's what's weighing on his shoulders. He's like, I am now responsible. My actions, I'm responsible for the murder of every one of my countrymen, the end of the race. All those guys working in Jerusalem, all those guys that moved back to Jerusalem, they're all dead. And we saw in Nehemiah and in Ezra that the surrounding people were happy to oblige to this edict. Secondly, the next verse says this. He went in front of the king's gate, and verse 3 says, every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting and weeping and wailing and laying in sackcloth and ashes. So what happens? One guy doesn't pray. The whole nation begins to pray. The whole of the people begin to cry out to God. There's a third reaction. So one is Mordecai crying out, 2, the people crying out. Third reaction is that of Esther. Esther is silent. She does nothing. Now, initially, she does nothing because it seems that somehow she didn't hear about the edict. She's living in the palace, and, sometimes you're the last one to know when you're the closest to the scenario. Okay, everyone out here is talking about, what's going on? Well, you just got fired. I did? Okay. So there's this event is happening. She doesn't know it's happening. But then word comes to her, hey, this is what's going on. And what she does is she says, I can't do anything. And Mordecai contacts her and says, listen, it's this famous verse. We'll look at it. It's worth reading. Verse 13. Mordecai told them to answer Esther, quote, do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. Listen, if this happens, you're going to die as well. Verse 14. If you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? It's the most famous statement in the book of Esther. If your Bible isn't highlighted there, it should be. Okay? Who knows whether God has placed you in these circumstances for this exact moment of time? And Esther then calls for a prayer meeting. She says, I need 3 days. And she sends out word, and for 3 days, the nation's praying for her. And after 3 days, chapter 5 reveals the answer to her prayers. Here's the answer. Answer number 1 to her prayer is that Esther has courage to approach the king. She says, I'll do it. Now, she needed courage because here's the rule. If you go before the king and you weren't invited to go to the king, he kills you. I mean, this is her husband, okay? She won the beauty pageant. Okay, that was the prize. I'm married to a guy that if I show up in a room and he didn't ask me to come in, he's going to kill me. Big prize. Like, whoopee. Hope you saw the movie Lucky Esther, right? That's the reality. That's what we're dealing with. If I go before him and he didn't call me, I'm dead. But after 3 days of praying, she's got the courage. She says, listen, if he kills me, he kills me. Second answer to the prayer is that Esther found favor with the king. She kind of peeks her head around the corner. He sees her. He takes his golden scepter. Picture this. He's got a golden scepter. Here's the rule. If he takes his golden scepter and he waves it towards her, that means you can come. Is that how you run your house? Kenny does marriage counseling if you do. Okay, I mean, just can you imagine your wife sticks her head around the corner and you decide, come to me, woman. Okay, or no. You're not coming. So she comes in. She finds favor. He says, what is it? What do you want? Third, not only did she have courage and favor, but she also received wisdom from the Lord when she prayed. She had something to do. He says, what do you want? She says, here's what I want. I want you to come to a special meal, just you and Haman. You and the prime minister, I want you to come and have a meal. And they come to the meal. Now, at the meal, they're eating, and it's like, okay, we're at this meal. Now, Ezra says to Esther, he says, now, what is it that you want? Like, we're here at this meal, what do you want? And this is the fourth thing that she received. She received that sensing from the Lord that it wasn't the right moment to ask. See, she said, can you come back tomorrow and we have a second meal? See, she wanted to ask him. What she wanted to say was, will you please stop the annihilation of 2 million people? Will you please stop wiping out every Jewish person from the entire empire? Would you please stop that? That's what she wanted to ask. Instead, she says, will you come back tomorrow? See, I think the Lord was speaking to her. So at this point, the story kind of goes 2 directions. We follow Haman out the door. He's stoked. I just got invited to a banquet with the queen and the king and just me. Yeah, that's awesome. He gets home and he goes, man, that was awesome. And I hate Mordecai and I want to kill him. And his wife, great wife, she says, well, why don't you just build a 75-foot tall gallows and you can hang him on it? He's like, oh, that's a great idea. So, you come from hanging out at the palace and all you can think about is murdering someone. At the same time, that night, Xerxes, the king, lays down. He can't sleep. He can't sleep. He tosses, he turns. He decides, I'm never going to fall asleep. So you and I would grab a book, right? He calls for people to read to him. I'm going to start doing that at my house when I can't sleep. Ring a bell, have one of the kids come down, read Dr. Seuss. But so they bring the records and they start reading the historical records. So you can imagine what these things are like. Well, they open up the historical records. They start reading. 5 years before, because there's a gap in the record from end of chapter 2 to chapter 3 of 5 years. And they start reading the record. 5 years ago, some guy named Mordecai found out about a plot to kill you, and it was reported, and you were saved. And the king says, well, that's interesting. What did we do for that guy? He says, it says we didn't do anything for him. He says, that's wrong. We got to do something. So the next morning, Haman shows up. He's all excited. He wants to get permission to kill Mordecai. And so he comes into the room, and the king says, hey, I got a question for you. He says, what should we do to someone that we want to honor? Like, I want to honor somebody. What should I do? And Haman, of course, thinks it's him. So he says, well, I think he should get to wear king clothes. He should ride on the king's horse. He should have one of the king's heralds out in front of him saying, this is the man the king honors, and we should parade him around the whole city. And the king says, that's an awesome idea. There's this guy named Mordecai. And Haman's just undone, And so look at, here's what the king does. He puts the clothes on Mordecai. He puts Mordecai on the horse. And guess who he makes lead the horse through the city saying this? That's right, Haman. Okay? So then Haman gets home. He's fully upset. And he gets home and knock on the door, and here's the police. And they're saying essentially, hey, it's time for you to go to back to this banquet. So now he walks into this banquet. It's him, the queen, Esther, and the king. And they sit down. And the king says, okay, now, Esther, why are we having these meals? What do you want? She says, he's trying to kill me and every single person that I'm related to. And the king says, he's doing what? He says, he's the one behind this edict to kill all the Jewish people, and I'm a Jewess. And the king walks outside like, oh my goodness, what happened? How did I get snookered into this deal? And as he's outside thinking, Haman falls before Esther, and he's pleading for his life, and he's grabbing hold of her. And the king walks in, and he sees this guy jumping on his wife. Haman hangs from the gallows he made for Mordecai. He's a dead man. God intervenes. Now, God intervenes, and Haman's dead, but there's still this law. And the king, though powerful, didn't have the power to change the law. So there's a law saying, in a few months, all of the people are going to turn against the Jews and kill them all. So they say, what do we do? And they devise a plan. Well, here's what we'll do. We'll send another edict. We'll have the king sign it, and it will be, very loudly promoted, and we'll tell all the people, all the Jewish people, hey, arm yourself and start training, because there's going to be a day coming when your neighbors are going to turn against you, and what we want you to do is wipe out anybody that tries to attack you. So they spread this word out. Most people gave up on the whole idea of fighting them, okay? But there was a battle. The Jews were victorious, and they survived. And then they established a feast. Chapter 9 tells about this feast. The feast is called Purim. And the word Purim is the plural form of the word pure. And the word pure means lot or dice, where you'd roll dice. And here's the thing. When they chose the date for annihilating the Jewish people, they chose it by casting lots. The Bible says that the lot is in the hand of God. And so they're rolling their dice. They're saying, what day should we kill them? They roll the dice. They say, here it is, 11 months. God gives God a timetable of 11 months to deal with the problem. 11 months later, the problem's eradicated. The Jewish people are rescued. And so a feast was established. They still celebrate it today. They celebrate the feast. It's really changed from kind of the biblical times. It carries some of the same characteristics, but it's kind of like a Halloween thing. Kids dress up. They share gifts. But they also read Esther. And there's something like 50 times that Haman's name is mentioned. And every time Haman's name is mentioned, everyone starts making all this crazy noise. And they got these little things in their hands that they spin. They go, and they bang stuff together, and they scream and yell. They want to blot out Haman's name. Nobody wants to. So every time, you can imagine the kids getting super excited because they know, like, his name's coming, his name's coming, his name's coming. And they go, bah! And they start freaking out. And so they're celebrating the fact that they've been victorious. Now, Adolf Hitler hated Purim. He hated that feast. And he saw part of his responsibility was to seek vengeance on Haman's unlawful death. And he actually targeted specific things on the dates of Purim against the Jewish people. And one of his cronies, the guy who was responsible for really the propaganda against the Jewish people, was one of the men who was hung as a result of war crimes at the end of World War II. And this man, as he walked up the gallows, he was the man, responsible for this propaganda. As he walked up to the gallows, he said, he referred to it as Purim 1946. And those were some of his last words as he then hung on a gallows like Haman had done. Such a hatred for him. Now, we've run out of time, but I'm not going to let you go yet, so sorry. I'm going to keep you here for just another minute, and I want to share with you a couple final thoughts. Quickly, why do we study this book? Number one, it gives us insight into the life of Persia at the time the Jews were living there. Number two, it reveals the cost of purity, but also the value of it. Vashti, unwilling to succumb to the immoral ways of the king, lost her title. She lost her role. It was costly. Esther, however, unwilling to acquiesce to the way that the women of the world lived, and she was honored for it by the Lord. Number three, the value of exhortation. Esther doesn't want to risk her life to go talk to the king. And yet Mordecai says, listen, this is the time. This is what God's raised you up for. This is what God has for your life. And she responds to that exhortation. And so don't be negligent. When God gives you a word of encouragement for someone else, don't be negligent to pass that on. Who knows what God will do with that? And then finally, the value or the main message here is the providence of God. And just let me read this to you real quickly, just through some of these providential works of God. One verse we'll put up on the screen, Isaiah 54, verse 17, please. No weapon formed against you will prosper. Every tongue which rises against you in judgment he shall condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is from me, says the Lord. That's a great promise, isn't it? Too bad it doesn't always feel like that. Sometimes it feels like you know there's this great crisis against you. For Esther and Haman, it went like this. Esther lost her parents. That's hard. She grew up as an orphan. She was raised by her older cousin. She was ripped from her home and made to parade before the king, and then chosen to be married to that guy. She spent years as the queen without any real divine intervention as to why. It was 5 years from her being selected as queen before the events happened where Mordecai says, hey, it's for such a time as this. And I think sometimes one of the hardest things about understanding what God is like, Lord, what are you doing? And then finally, when the opportunity goes, it was at the penalty of death. Mordecai, this guy gives his life to raise Esther. He does everything he do to protect her, and she's taken by the king. He refuses to bow for whatever reason, and it almost costs the nation their lives. And yet throughout this book, what do we see? While they're not seeing God, God's at work. God's got a plan. And I want to encourage you, because I think that all of us face those dark hours. All of us face those times that are just hard. We wonder where the Lord is. We wonder what's going on. I would encourage you to read through the pages of the Book of Esther. See the hand of God. Respond the way that they did. As they sought the Lord, they remained faithful to him, and God accomplished his purposes in their life.